70% of the books of children and young adults are either white or animals, and we need to get them to be more diverse. And yeah, so we want to have more stories that sound like us, feel like us, and look like us, so that we can see ourselves represented. And that's the reason, as a non-profit, we want to bring to you artists and authors and creatives from the diaspora. I'm going to probably pick on just one person. And I'll start with Debasmita. So, you have a different format. You use a lot of visual storytelling formats. So talk to us about one thing that we've been talking since morning. Like, I began this at 5:30 my time, so it was quite early. But we were all talking about how do you stay motivated, and what gives that, how do you sort of hold on to your creative inspiration?
But thank you so much. First of all, it's really amazing to be here and talk about these things. I think all of us were part of this ecosystem, and Upasana, you and I had a conversation last week about this, that we all have a role to play, whatever little role we could do, but we should do our bit, and that's what we're doing here. And I'm very excited to be here for that. In terms of staying motivated, I think first of all, that's a very internal thing. Because I can give you lots of ideas, but what works for you will work differently for me. But one very important thing for me to stay motivated is to experience other forms of creative expressions all the time. So like you said, I'm a visual storyteller. I mostly create graphic novels, and I also illustrate picture books. But at the same time, I also like to watch good cinema, I hear good music, and most importantly, meeting interesting people. And they do not have to be always, everybody is creative, whether they know it or not, sometimes. But just meeting people, meeting different people, that opens a lot of doors and windows for everyone and makes you think more intently about life, about what you want to do, how you want to tell a story. And that always keeps me motivated.
That's so interesting. And it's this is so important, because we talked about this as a group, that how internal it is, and what works for me may work differently for someone else. So it's important to have that moment of reflection on, here is what works the best for me, and I'm going to hold on to that. So I appreciate that clarity, because I don't know if you've seen, sometimes I see headlines which will say, here is the writer's advice, which is great, but you cannot follow, which is true, because we are just all different people. So it does matter that what works for you. Farah, I'm going to go to you next, because you are, first of all, I'm having a hard time not to be a fangirl, because I love Farah's work so much. Right now, I just read back-to-back things that she wrote, and I'm like, oh my God, my head is blowing away. So she's an incredible writer. And you've written about stories, I know you're in a different location right now. Similar to me, I grew up in India, but I don't live in India anymore. So I feel how do you, the stories that are in your new book, for example, are from Pakistan and very deeply rooted in that, I guess the feel of the stories is very much rooted in where you come from. How do you sort of create authenticity, because that may be not your current experience, and it is someone else's story that you're inhabiting? So the reason I'm saying that is because sometimes we'll enter stories from a place of privilege, and I do that all the time, and I need to constantly check myself, because I'm not that person who's experiencing the tragedy that you've sort of described in your book, or the poverty, or really hard situations. So how do you kind of bring yourself to write stories which are so different from what you're experiencing?
Thank you so much, Upasana, first of all, for this. I'm so glad I'm meeting people. It's such a high, a creative high, to meet people online like this who write and who like the literature. Your questions are so good. How do I don't know how well I inhabit the characters that I try to write about. First of all, I think it'll be really presumptuous of me to think that I do full justice to all of them. But see, I grew up in Karachi. I finished my high school there. I mean, secondary school there. I got my first job there. I spent a good amount of my growing up years there. And as cities go, Karachi is huge, and it's quite an assault on the senses. You don't live in a you cannot stay cut off from noise, from what's happening in the city. It's affecting every part of you growing up. You know, like if there's a strike somewhere, your school's shut off. If the power is out, you're sleeping on the roof. Mm-hmm. So growing up, I think I was just absorbing all these things constantly, writing stories in my head all the time, however they were, but all the time just being a huge radar. I think it was my way of, and then I was writing in my journal, or I was writing my own little short stories as a kid, and then as a teen, and then as a younger adult. But all the time, they were all just results of what I was hearing and observing and feeling, and it coming out in a fictionalized format. I wasn't fictionalizing the lives of people I knew, but I think when you're constantly tuned in, similar to what Debasmita said, like when you're talking to somebody as a writer, I think there's a second form of you, which is kind of making notes up above your head. And it's strange, but even in really bad times or tragic times, sometimes there's a small remove, and you're kind of observing yourself as well. So I was always observing things and people. So even though I don't live there, I haven't lived in Pakistan since 2006. So it's been a bunch of years. But I feel very much like mentally I'm there. Wherever I'm living, Dubai or London or wherever, I don't think my mind has inhabited that place, though I'm physically there. So when I start writing, I don't think I will not write about being back home for me for quite some time. I think there's many stories there left in me that I need to get out. And also I have this urge to put things down on paper, like a record, however temporary that record is. But even if it's like by a brief mention of a roundabout in Karachi, or how the weather was, or how something tasted. But it's a compulsion. I will need to put it down. Where it is in the story, that's only for me. It's like a personal little tick, I think. But I think I'm not done writing about Pakistan or Karachi.
And that's so nice, because I feel like that's my relatability moment to your writing, because I've been outside of India for a while, but I can't get it out of my head. Like my stories will still keep going back there, because I feel like there's a physical sense of where you are and there is a mental sense of where you are, and those can be different. Let me move to Shetal now, because Shetal has such an interesting story. Like, you've literally changed careers, and I know what you've talked about earlier when we spoke on what inspired you. But tell this group, like, what inspired you to suddenly do this book? Like, what was the motivational factor?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm having a fangirl moment being among such talented company. So thank you. But yes, I made that career switch from education to writing full time, and I taught for 15 years, predominantly in girls' schools. And I grew up in the United States. My parents came in the 1970s from India, and so growing up in the 80s and 90s, I didn't see much in the U.S. Books, media that was inclusive of my heritage and identity. And so I remember, I think it was much later in high school when I first read a novel that, really captured my experience growing up in the US. And I remember that feeling of, that sense of belonging, that sense of, oh, wow, I'm not an exception to the American story. I'm not an outlier, because my whole childhood reading history textbooks, going through the American, curriculum, there were very rare opportunities where I saw myself in those textbooks. And if I did, it was a paragraph. And so so remembering that feeling, and then eventually becoming a teacher myself and a world studies teacher, I was really motivated as an educator to bring in as much diversity and inclusion to the curriculum as I could, but I struggled in finding the resources to help make the lessons, the activities, to provide students some sort of, resource to use to build their learning off of, was a challenge. And so I knew there was an opportunity in literature and also in education to really close in that diversity gap. And then I became a mom, and raising the next generation of Indian Americans, I really wanted to make sure that they grew up, feeling a sense of pride and that sense of belonging. And, being a family that loves books and loves reading, I definitely wanted to make sure that they had the exposure that they needed in the books that they read. And then, having that girls' school experience, it really inspired me to think about how we can share more of the stories of women in the books that we read, in nonfiction reading, and really highlight the women that have, made a difference, that are unsung heroes, and to really help, bring awareness and, kind of address sort of, the patriarchy and think about gender equality. And so all of those together is what really inspired me to think about how I can be part of, how I can bring more awareness to these issues through writing and creativity.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things you said there which spoke to me very strongly. Like, everything changes when you become a parent, because I feel like when I became a mom, suddenly I was very aware of what is my child reading. Because, and the funny part is, Shetal, although you grew up here and you sort of questioned, like, do you see yourself represented? I grew up in India, and I'm sure, like, Debasmita, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Most people that I'm talking to, I've now talked to tens of authors and creatives. They are saying the same things that you're saying, that we grew up reading a lot of British literature. I mean, the colonial impact on our cultures is quite real, right? So all of us grew up reading Jane Austen, or the famous five, or like all those kinds of books, which I know, Farah, is true for you as well, because I have friends from Pakistan, and one of our board members is from Lahore, and they talked to us about, there's a Jane Austen tea club in Lahore, which I thought was so funny. But it's fun. It's like nice to have literature enthusiasts, but it's kind of strange that so many of us grew up, even on this part of the world, without seeing ourselves reflected so well. There's a lot of regional literature, and there is children's literature that had Indian themes or Asian themes, but that was not necessarily the most common experience. We were relying a lot on English, British literature. And you guys tell me if you had different experiences, because that's what I'm hearing, and that was my personal experience as well.
No, that's completely correct. Enid Blyton, the whole works of Enid Blyton, and all the old English classics, Jane Austen, Thomas Hardy, Charles Dickens, that's what the library had. If Urdu, for me in Pakistan, if Urdu literature for children was available, it was in the form of digests, which were, I read everything, even the really moral stories, all the behavior related stories, but I read it all. But after a certain age, I couldn't find anything, or it wasn't in our school libraries for young adults, or for, what my kids now read. So nothing like that was available. Yeah. Not that I could find it.
Yeah.
I had a slightly different experience growing up, because I'm from Calcutta, and Bengali literature has a very strong influence. And it was also like, whether it's in your family or in the city or in the state, it was always very, very strong. And not just Bengali literature, I would also say, because of the left inclination, there was always Russian literature available. There was Chinese literature available. I have read a lot of, Chinese literature growing up, Chinese poetry, for example, and folk tales from Russia. That was something which was a very common thing in, Bengali Bengali households because of the left movement, and also watching a lot of theater, which is homegrown theater like national theater, regional theater, also stories, Bengali stories. I think again last week, Upasana, you and I had a conversation, and I was telling you about women writers, Bengali women writers who were so progressive and so empowered. Reading them, I mean, I never felt that kind of absence in stories, because for me it was English and Bengali going hand in hand all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And also seeing people around me who were writing. My mother is a writer, so she used to write in Bengali, and I used to always feel that, this is a very common thing to do it. It actually became more, this whole idea of underrepresentation became more obvious to me when I left Calcutta.
Mm-hmm.
When I stepped out of Calcutta, I started working in other parts of India, plus outside of India. There I started realizing that, what? This is not a very common experience. I had a very special experience growing up. So now I completely relate to it, because wherever I go, I still see a lot of underrepresentation of brown stories or people of color. But growing up was a very different experience for me.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and I can imagine that with Bengali literature being so rich and having diversity in itself. I will say that every single other Indian person I've spoken to, apart from Debasmita, has a different experience. So what you did was definitely special, and I think we want to talk. That's why, talking with you guys, sort of, I get ideas around. Oh, here is a book they were reading when they were young. But literally, if you guys know, this group here will know, there are only 2 books that get called out for me each time I'm talking to an Indian person. Amar Chitra Katha, which are like those Panchtantra tales, which are like behavioral stories that you were talking, Farah. It's like they will tell you the moral of the story. That's the story. Or R.K. Narayan is the other author who did short stories about a South Indian experience, really, really interesting, that a lot of people talk about, which we've experienced. But I mean, just to say that, of course, when you grow up in South Asia, you're also absorbing a lot more than just literature, right? There's movies and there's drama and what you see and experience, which also obviously makes you feel different. So there is also truth to the fact that this whole question about diversity, or are we represented well, is more obvious when you're outside of it. At the same time, though, I will say that there is a lot of the writing that we see coming from Indian authors who are now trying to have Indian stories within India, for example, are still very urban sometimes. And I belong to that group, so it's not like I'm dismissing it. It is its own story, but they still continue to be from places and people who do have a sense of privilege, getting into the fact that, I can pick up a thing and I can write. I mean, not everyone has that ability or that platform to do that. And so I think, I keep saying that my goal as an organization is, how do we get more people to recognize their inner creativity, which everyone is born with. Everyone is born creative. You sometimes just have to recognize this. So, on that point, I want to go around the table just quickly for a quick tip for you guys. This is a group of people who've talked about creativity for the last 2 days. So I would love to know from each of you, and Shetal, I'm going to start with you, on what's a tip you would give to a new writer, someone who's building a story now.
Sure. And considering I'm fresh in this world, I'm definitely, I am trying to follow my own advice, as well as to keep reading and also keep learning, keep signing up there's workshops everywhere. There's YouTube videos. I mean, just this constant, thirst for building your craft and exposing yourself to different styles and experimenting. I think, is just sort of an instrumental part of, building your creativity. And I would say that in any profession, right? There's that professional development component. As an educator, I was constantly seeking opportunities to grow my ability in the classroom. I would say that applies in your writing as well.
Mm-hmm. Farah, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say definitely read very widely. For me, I love reading poems as well as short fiction. I don't write it, but I read it. And for me, that's also a point of I mean, I don't want to say inspiration, but it might start something somewhere. But poems are not the only thing. Watch good cinema, and if you can, like, find yourself a small cohort of, writers who will give you good constructive feedback, just to keep the momentum going. Just not for accountability only, but it's good to have a small community, because otherwise you're writing by yourself all the time. But every now and then, know that there's a small support group. It's a good additional thing to have.
Yeah, I love that. I definitely use that myself, so I completely relate to it. Debasmita, what would be your tip?
I think Farah and Shetal, they have said it. I just want to add one thing, that because this happens to me, I come across lots of ideas and then I forget. So I always try to keep a notebook. So please write it down before you forget about it.
Yeah, that's I think, wasn't it Bird by Bird? I think that book has that tip on, like, she had sticky notes everywhere because she was forgetting her ideas. So definitely important. Okay, I know that Shetal has a hard stop at the end of the hour, so I want to actually go back to these authors and have them tell us what are the new things that they are working on, because to me that's so inspiring to learn what is coming up. I know, Farah, I hate to do this, but I already told them what you're doing, but I still want you to, like, show us what you're working on. And Shetal and Debasmita, please tell us, like, what are some of the things that we should be expecting as readers coming from you. Go ahead, anyone can start.
I'll just mention my book because Upasana has been so kind to get a galley of it. It's my book is a novel coming out in October from Dzanc Books in the US. I've never written a novel before, and I didn't think I would end up writing a novel before, but here it is. And it's a short novel by my standards. It's I don't know if you wanted me to give like a small description.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's basically, as the way I write is, it's not about the lack of it's not about the politics of the lack of water, but it's about how that affects a family, really, like the interiority of it, how it shapes their behaviors, shapes their relationships with each other. Because growing up in Pakistan, and there are parts of it that are constantly drought struck, and sometimes they get rain, but most often, there's a drought and it's fine the next year. So there's that lack of dependency on water. I just wanted to explore what something like that would do to a small family. So
yeah, it's incredible. It's a really, really good book. And Farah, like, I don't think I said this to you before, but for anyone who's read Nectar in a Sieve, it's an old classic, 1952. That is what it reminded me of. I'm going to send you a link because you should probably read that book if you haven't. It's really deeply interior, and so it's going to take you. We were talking about this thing about having a third rail, where you think about internal transformations that happen because of an external plot point, and in this case it is this lack of water, and what that does to the characters is very intriguing. And I think everyone heard me say this about a framework that we were talking about earlier, but this is a great example and a use case where you would see it play out, where the transformation or internal transformations are very vividly visible for all of the characters. And so when I'm teaching a workshop, that's a book, a great example to share of doing it well.
So can I have the name of the book, please, Farah?
My book is called The River, the Town. What a good question. I should. The
River, the Town.
Yes.
Okay.
Shetal, I'm going to go to you next because I see the book behind you. Is that the book behind you?
Oh my gosh, yes. I keep forgetting it's there. There it is. Yes, it just came out, Shakti Girls. It is a collection of rhyming stories, poems about remarkable women from India. Some well-known, some, unsung heroes. And, my mission behind it is to really help the next generation and really all children to learn about who these remarkable people are from India. And so it just came out 2 weeks ago, and I wrote it in poetry and rhyming scheme to help engage early readers. My younger son actually inspired me to write it in that format because he enjoyed reading books that had that sing-songy sound to it, and it kept him engaged. And so I So I wrote it in that format to tell the lives of these women. And hopefully I've started working on the second book, and hopefully this will become a series. I'm planning like 3 to 5 books. These are 13 stories. So hopefully sometime next year, there will be another 13 stories to share. As I do school visits, I'm getting a lot of input from students on who they want to see in the next book. So that's exciting. But yes, Shakti Girls came out a few weeks ago.
That's amazing.
Fantastic.
Congratulations.
Is it the one illustrated by Kavita Rajput?
It is.
Oh,
It
okay.
is.
Yes,
Yes.
because Kavita and I, we are Instagram buddies.
Oh,
So
nice.
I've seen the promotion on Instagram.
Yes, she did a remarkable job. The cover's beautiful. Really.
The cover's gorgeous.
Yeah, she did a great job.
Debasmita, I know you have tons of stories coming, so tell us one.
No, but I'll limit it to just 2. Okay. So one is this. This is a graphic novel. It's called Terminal 3. This is my latest graphic novel. It's getting launched on 17th of April. It's with Penguin. And this is a story about a Kashmiri girl. Her name is Khwab Nazir. And Khwab is a jiu-jitsu champion. And this is a story about her and her living in the valley, in a conflict zone, and but not leaving her dreams. So it's a story about hope and dreams, something that I've written and illustrated. And as I said, it's getting launched on 17th of April. And since we talked a lot about cinema, so I just want to mention it here. And I know there are people from India. So my first film as a writer and producer is going to be available on Netflix across Asia Pacific from 28th of April.
That's amazing. What's it called?
It's called Before Life After Death.
Ooh, okay, wow, that's interesting. Okay, definitely take a note. I feel like if it's only in Asia Pacific, I have to wait till I go back to
Yes,
India.
I mean, including myself, I will not be able to see
Wish
it.
you all the best for your upcoming books and the books that you just released. All the best.